Tomatoes. We all imagine those wonderful tomatoes that we harvest out of our garden. At the starting point, and the step that I think a lot of gardeners either don't pay enough attention to or maybe even don't think about all that much, is the planting stage. So a few basics about tomatoes. Let's say that you want to plant a tomato garden, you have a good sunny spot. You've decided, are you going to plant in raised beds, in your garden soil, in straw bales? What kind of tomatoes do you want? What colors? What plant types? What flavors are you after? And how close are you going to plant them together? So these are all important planting steps. So the first really important basic thing to understand is hybrid versus heirloom. And hybrids are seeds that are created by crossing two parent varieties together. And if you do the cross and tomatoes form, the seeds in that tomato are the hybrid seed. They're designated in catalogs as F1, as in first generation. And the variety of hybrids available is far less than non-hybrids or open pollinated. However, they may have some specific disease tolerances and resistances that will help them grow better in your garden. Examples of hybrids would be Sun Gold cherry tomato, Sweet Million, Lemon Boy, Whopper, etc. The vast majority of tomatoes are open pollinated, and many of these open pollinated types are considered heirlooms, which means they have stories and some age and longevity associated with them. So Cherokee Purple, Brandywine. Some varieties that are fairly recent and stable, such as the Dwarf tomato project varieties, I don't think they can be considered heirlooms yet, because some of them are only 5 or 10 years old and we don't know if they're going to have staying power. With open pollinated types, you can save seed and pass them on, whereas with hybrids, if you save seeds, they will segregate. The second generation will give you things that look like either parent and things in between. And even if you save seeds from those, they won't yet be stable. Open pollinateds, you can save seed and they will breed true. And that is where you get the vast array of colors and sizes and shapes. So 10, 12,000 or more different types of open pollinated varieties. The other basic term that you really need to know, indeterminate, determinate, dwarf, 3 different growth habits. Indeterminate, of which the vast majority of tomatoes are, will grow infinitely upward and outward. They sucker all over the place. They need trellising or caging. So again, Brandywine, Cherokee Purple, Sun Gold are indeterminate types, and you'll need a strategy for dealing with those. How many suckers will you leave, or will you let them all grow? How will you stake them, etc.? Determinate and dwarf both stay at about 3 or 4 feet tall, so they're a good choice for people who are growing in containers and are space challenged and just don't want to erect a stake and climb a ladder and tie that plant up. Determinates tend to ripen their crop almost all at once. The best known would be Roma types, 3 to 4 feet tall, produce 20 pounds of tomatoes, and then the plant's about done. There aren't all that many determinants, and the numbers, the variety of colors and flavors is just not there. With dwarfs, which are a variety that is coming to prominence due to our dwarf tomato project, can be considered just like indeterminates, except they grow at half the vertical rate. So the eventual height really does depend on the amount of sun you get. But if you will grow a 10-foot tall Cherokee Purple, a corresponding dwarf will end up about 5 feet tall. The last consideration for planting, the more sun you get, the larger tomato you can grow successfully, recognizing that when it gets to 90 degrees or greater under high humidity, the flowers don't always pollinate very well on those large ones. If you get 2, 3, 4 hours a day, stick to the smaller tomatoes, cherry tomatoes, golf ball size. So those are some basics for you to help you get started. Okay, now we're going to go into some different methods of starting seeds. And you'll notice here in this plug flat, there are lettuce growing. I'm out of plug flats, but I wanted to demonstrate how I do that, and also there's a different pot over here. So One of the most important factors in successful seed starting is using a good quality sterile soilless mix. It's nice, it's fluffy, it doesn't have damping off disease, fungus in it. So it's as simple as filling a few cells with the soilless mix. When I'm starting tomatoes, I'll actually plant all 50 cells and then watering it down to compress it down a little bit. The other alternative, if you wanted to do plants in single containers, would be to fill a container with soilless mix. I'm a little short here, but I'm one-handed, so let's just pretend this is up at the top. Again, water that well. And you can plant as many seeds as you want in these cells. Some people will plant 1 or 2. I don't have a greenhouse, and I need lots of plants per unit space, so I'll plant up to 50 or 100 seeds. And I'm just going to test plant a few tomatoes here. Let's say I just wanted to sprinkle some seeds around there. This is a variety from 2004 that I'm not sure if it's going to germinate well, but I'm just using it because I've got plenty and I can play with it. Let's say, so those got about 10 each. Sprinkle the seeds around the top, you can see them, and then just take some of the soilless mix and barely cover those seeds, and until you can't see them anymore, like this. And we'll do it to this pot over here as well. That's as deep as you really need to plant them. And if you plant them any deeper than that, it just takes them longer to germinate. Then I take a spray bottle and I gently moisten the top of the seeds. And that's it. Now what I'll do with these, so what I do with these is just lightly cover with a piece of saran wrap, and this whole flat will go on a heat mat in my office in front of a south-facing window. And I'll get tomatoes germinating in about 4 days. And as soon as they germinate, I'll remove the plastic, and then it's time for the hardening off period, getting them used to the outdoor conditions, and transplanting, which we'll cover next. Now let's talk briefly about transplanting. And I don't have any transplantable tomatoes at the moment, but we're going to demonstrate on this lettuce because the principle is the same, except instead of going single plant per 3-inch pot, I'm going to plant several. But I just popped this collection of seedlings out of the plug flat, and I'm just going to squeeze them gently with my thumb, and you'll see that the plants come apart really easily. Lettuce is actually trickier than tomatoes because they've got such tender roots, but there you go. Now, I fill the pot with the soilless planting medium, and I don't, unlike with seeding, I actually don't wet it, because if I wet the surface of that soil, it'll become quite stiff and resistant. And I just lay the seedlings on. So let's do one here. I'm going to see if I can hold the camera and do this one-handed. Gather the roots around my finger and just push, and that lettuce seedling is transplanted. Put another one on here. Look for where the base of those seedlings, here's the roots, and then I'm just going to push gently in, and there we go. Tuck the roots in, move the soil around. I'm going to plant the rest of these after I'm done with this video, but then I just water really well. I've got my number, this is lettuce number 15, and I'm cross-referenced to an Excel spreadsheet. So do this with tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, whatever. With tomatoes, you probably want to do 1 plant per cell. Bury them deeply. I actually bury everything right up to the leaves, the lettuce, peppers, you name it. But tomatoes really benefit from deep transplanting because they will root along the stems. Once these are done, I actually just put them on the floor of my garage for 2 or 3 days or in the shade so that they get used to the conditions. And these have to be hardened off at this point before they go outside. So if you've hardened them off in this plug flat, then they'll take less hardening off than if you leave them indoors because of weather conditions, and then you do the transplanting. You want to ease them into the sun slowly. So that's all there is to it.
So I grow in buckets. Why do I grow in buckets versus the soil? Well, my soil's naturally sandy, but it also harbors a lot of wilt. And if I grow tomatoes in the frequency and the numbers that I want to grow, I can't really do the crop rotations here at my place. So usually I'll end up losing a lot of tomatoes to wilt. And with wilt, it's not like a tomato disease that you can kind of make it through and collect your fruit. It's just gone. So what I found is being able to put them in containers, I can, one, control the soil conditions a lot better. I can also avoid the wilt and grow consistently the amount of tomatoes that I want to, especially for breeding. I choose a 5-gallon container, somewhat because of uniformity, but I do use the nursery pots. Anything from, I would say, 5 gallons and above would be good. You can use it for indeterminate, determinate, and dwarf tomato. Now, your indeterminate tomato can go in a larger container, but it also can grow in this. So just know that as it continues to grow, it's going to need a little bit more water. It's going to get large, so you might have a heavy plant outside of this container. But that's kind of the point, right? Is to get your fruit and your tomatoes to be really healthy and continuing to grow. So it's important to notice, though, that on the container itself, it's got holes, right? A pot usually comes with holes, but there are containers that you can buy at a local box store that have no drainage on them at all. They're more decorative than anything else. So if you're going for something more decorative, make sure there's a drainage hole. It doesn't need to be specifically on the bottom. I actually like to have a little bit of reservoir of water, so if there wasn't holes on the bottom and I was watering in here, the water would at least get to this line and stay here. And then if it goes above it, it would drain out. That's especially important when you're talking about a heavy rain and the buckets or whatever the container that you're growing in is filling up with water. As it comes, as you move up, these aren't necessarily needed, but it does allow for a little bit of airflow to kind of reach the roots that don't normally get there. You would not want your hole, you would not want your hole all the way up top there and no other ones, just because you wanted a higher reservoir. It wouldn't make that much sense because it would fill up with this much water before it would start to drain out. And that's kind of a dangerous situation because the roots of plants breathe oxygen, and when they're submerged in water, they're not getting the oxygen that they actually need. I do use a soil mix. I used to buy it by the bag. It just got so expensive. And so what I found was just going to your local nursery and asking them if they sell their potting mix by the cubic yard. You can either get it, if you have a truck, you can get it loaded. I don't have a truck, so I get it delivered. And it works out really, really well. I usually get 4 cubic yards, but it's way more than I need. What I actually utilize this stuff for later on is for other trees and plants as I'm growing up, or I'm moving pots up. So I always have plenty of extra, and I have plenty to dig into later into the season. I do prefer these box store 5-gallon containers versus, let's say, like a paint container or a mastic container, which is almost like this white plastic. It's almost clear. Those don't have the durability that when they're out in the sun as these ones do, or even the blue buckets by the other box company. Just in the sense of durability, these are much, much better. But the nursery pots are fine too. If you have nursery pots, then utilize those. The key really is to find something that works for you. What's in your, whether it's in your yard or whether somebody has a bunch of extras, you can easily just drill holes in it. The reason why you don't want one that's of that other type of plastic is when you're lifting these up to move them around in the spring and you're using this lip, they can have a tendency to chip. And when I mean chip, they'll just go ahead and the plastic will just break off, and then it will fall to the ground, and then you have to pick up the tomato and have to deal with all that and go find another bucket, and you just wasted your time. So that's pretty much it when it comes to growing in actual plastic buckets. I do grow in soil still, but at home I choose to use a bucket because it just allows me to do so much more and so much more often than I would normally have. And then, so what do I do with the soil after this? I try not to reuse it. There probably is no issue with me utilizing it or reusing some of it and refreshing the top. But I just have such poor soil on my property that I'll go ahead and I'll put it in the other garden beds that I have, and it makes it, I'm slowly improving the soil, and then I'll bring another a bunch in. You could utilize other stuff like wood chips after they've decomposed for maybe 1 to 2 years as a material, but you definitely want to use something that's a little bit more decomposed like this, because as you're adding nitrogen to your soil or to whatever potting mix you're utilizing, you want it to be able to take that nitrogen in. But other than that, it's pretty simple, it's pretty easy, and you just got to keep it watered and fertilized. And that's it.
All right, planting a tomato in a straw bale, one-handed no less. So this straw bale, I have one spot left in it because this variety took a while to get going. And this bale was prepared over a 2-week period by adding nitrogen alternating days and then watering heavily and then adding a balanced fertilizer. But that's another story. So we just want to plant this tomato. And ordinarily there wouldn't be stakes in the ground already, but that's fine. And what's nice about bales after they've been treated for a while is they're nice and soft. So you can see I can get right into that. There's my stake. I'm going to just plop this tomato out of its pot. Here it is, without breaking the stem. Nice root system on it. Okay, so now I'm going to seat that into the bale pretty deep, and you'll notice there's a little bit of a space around here. So I'm just going to take some good quality planting mix, and this is just a commercial soilless mix amended with some composted cow manure. Pat it down nice and level. That's really the only potting mix that you need to use. And I'm going to water this, and I'm going to water regularly because in the bales they dry out more quickly, and that's all there is. Now let's look at what a tomato plant looks like that was planted at that size just a couple of weeks later, and there it is. Alright, so our next bit of fun is going to be one-handed planting of a tomato in a grow bag. So here I have in this wheelbarrow a mixture of soilless mix and composted cow manure, and I'm going to see if I can make this work. Almost, but enough. So there, I want to get some dirt in there enough to get it to sit flat so I can add the rest in. Here we go. Filling up the grow bag with the really nice fluffy mix, and you can certainly use the mix of your choice. There's organic options, there are standard options that you can get at the big box store. I like to mix it with like a composted cow manure. And you don't really have to fill these 5-gallon grow bags, and maybe I'll show you a grow bag here. This is a box of 40, and they come with pre-perforated holes. They're less than $1 each when you buy them in quantity, and they last for years. So since I'm not going to do this absolutely perfectly right now, just for purposes of time, let's say that this was a little bit fuller than that. And I've got a tomato, a dwarf tomato here, Dwarf Buddy's Heart, and you can see that it's pretty tall right now, and I'm going to bury a lot of those leaves. So I'm going to lay this on its side. I'm actually going to remove foliage near the bottom, there and there. I could remove more, dig a really deep hole in this nice fluffy potting soil, pop this out of the pot, and there's the plant with its nice root ball. Then I'm going to sink this in almost to the bottom, and I'm going to just center it, work the potting mix around it. That tomato is planted. I'll probably add some more potting mix to this to raise it up a little bit. I'll water it well, and that's all there is to it. In about 65 days from today, I should be picking tomatoes, and you'll see there is actually a bud that's about to open. I don't remove buds on tomatoes when I'm planting them. Even if the plant has little tomatoes, the plant will be fine and you'll have early tomatoes. So that's how I just planted that tomato plant. It's a dwarf variety in a grow bag, and I plant in the garden the same way. Plant deep. The only thing different is I would use a cutworm collar, bury it deeply, mulch immediately to keep the soil from splashing on the leaves. Now I will mulch this with grass clippings, not so much to keep this nice sterile potting mix from the leaves, but to help it to retain moisture so that I'm not watering them constantly. And that's all there is to it. So this is how I stake and tie my plants that are planted in the ground. So a few things. You'll notice these plants are well mulched. The goal is to keep the soil off the lower foliage so that disease doesn't splash up on the leaves. Let's look at this sun gold right here. I've driven an 8-foot stake into the ground, and I've already taken a few ties on this sun gold. One there, one a little bit above. And my next one will probably be about right here. Again, this plant is suckering. Here's one that's really easy to see, right there. Look for that 45-degree angle between the leaves and the stem. And suckering really is only a concern for indeterminate varieties. You don't want to remove suckers or any growth from determinates or dwarfs. So that's all there is to it, really. And I expect very tall plants. Now, cherry tomatoes I don't really sucker at all because I want maximum productivity. So I will just make loops of twine and tie everything all the way up the plant, and this is going to be a tomato machine, and it will become kind of unmanageable, but that's okay because later in the year when the garden starts going out of control, that's what happens. All right, let's talk about staking and pruning, and I'll show a couple of different ways. This is how I stake tomatoes if they're in a straw bale when I can drive the stake into the ground. So I've got what I call a guide here a guide stake that will I can tie the plant to because there's a gap right down here between the stake and the pole, and if I snake the plant over that before I start the tie, when that plant loads with fruit and gets heavy, it can come down and snap. So this plant, let's look at how I've done this. I just take ties with twine. There's one right here. There's one right here. And as this plant goes up, I'll make another tie. Then eventually it's going to reach this pole, and it will go all the way up to the top, which is about 7 feet. Let's look at suckers. So everywhere that leaves come out, and here's the main stem right here, this is a sucker, and there's one lower down right here, and there's one emerging right here. Suckers are neither good nor bad, but all indeterminate tall growing tomatoes sucker. So you want to have a strategy of how many suckers you let grow. Right now this plant has 1, 2, 3, 4, has about a half a dozen. If I let all of those go, it's fine. The plant will do great. I'll have enormous yields, but the plant will become pretty difficult to manage. I've grown them like that. If you're caging, you don't really have to sucker at all. Let everything go. So I'll probably remove several and let, on this type of a plant with this type of a staking method, I may let 3 suckers go. So I'll have 4 fruiting stems that will flower and fruit. Suckering is nothing to be afraid of. It's just, and if you remove suckers, you can't really make a mistake because they'll just keep producing suckers above, and every sucker will produce more.
If you've grown tomatoes before, you know that they first start off standing up really well, and then all of a sudden they're on the ground. A little bit of water on top of them. So let's talk a little bit about how we can keep them off the ground, keep that airflow going, and keep them away from any soil pathogens. Here's an example of one that kind of got away. I did have a bamboo post or a bamboo stake in there, and I attach it using this green stretchable plastic tie. I would always go with the thinner version. They have a thicker version, but go with the thinner version. It's much more manageable and it's much less plastic use. But anyways, you can see it's kind of grown up and meandered into this tree. Now I'll probably leave that part growing up into the tree because it's doing fine and the trees can easily hold the fruit of that part of that tomato. But I got some that's sticking off to the side. So in this, what do? Do you cut it off? It's already got fruit on it. No, I'm not going to cut it off. But what I can do is I could take a bucket like this, right? I can take another 5-gallon bucket, or if it was in the ground, you can put it in the ground, and I may just move that bucket over, and then just tie up the tomato plant vine to that stake to hold it up, because at some point the moisture or the water is going to fill these tomatoes up. Eventually, and what will end up happening is it'll weigh down the branch, and it may break it right here at the corner here. So it's one of those things you have to watch out for. Here's an example of the Florida weave. You can see I use PVC, but what I have underneath the PVC is like a U-post, or just a regular green U-post. You can get this at a box store, and then you can get the PVC there. But the idea is just find stuff you have around the house. Whether it's old pieces of lumber, whether you already have some sort of like small tree that you could attach it to. I use twine. You can use all sorts of different things. Anything that's going to hold up for a season, work out. I just like the twine a little bit better working with it. But anything really can help, keeping these plants off of there. But the key really is you tie it to one end here. These are about 8 feet apart, and you can kind of see it's hanging just a little bit, but it will hold those plants regardless of whatever way it goes. But I basically tie it to one side, run it all the way down. I will wrap it around. If there is bamboo, I will wrap it around it as structure. But I will go to the other side, I'll wrap it, come back, and the idea is that you really want to have your twine going like this, and your tomato vine coming up through the middle. You don't want to tie your tomato vine up with the string, because if you do that, it'll eventually, as the weight of the tomato pushes, it'll actually go into the actual vine. So the best thing to do is to keep it off, allow it to kind of come up, and the leaves will go ahead and leaves and fruit will sit on this, and it will hold up perfectly fine. That's a really good way to do it, especially with growing in Florida. It's called, like I said, so again, it's called the Florida weave, and I'll string up another round here, but you can see there's only a certain point I can go up to. After that, I don't expect to keep the tomatoes, so that's probably 7 feet tall. Those PVC posts. So I've got another about 1.5 feet to kind of go, and they can stick out a little bit more. You could also just stick a large stake in the ground that was tall enough, and just keep tying it, and then just prune out any of the additional branches. So you can see how it'll go ahead and split here. So that wouldn't really work with a good stake. So you have to keep trimming out. So as you can see, these suckers coming out here between the branches, those you would cut out if you were just doing a single stake. Now, what's great about that is, there's a lot less work you have to do. You just have to tie up the plant. But you're going to be cutting out some of the fruit. You will be cutting out some of that production, but it just depends on what works for you, what can you do, what's available, what's the space that you have. Now, if you've seen those tomato cages like this at your local box store, they're all over the place, and they're great for dwarf plants, or they're great for determinate plants. They're not great for indeterminates. They will go right up over the top of that thing and flop over, and you have a large tomato cage you've got to work through. So what I would suggest doing is, if you had a dwarf plant like this, you could go ahead and put that on top of it. This is only going to grow about another foot and a half at the most. And what's great about a dwarf plant is, obviously, it stays small. If you have small spaces, it works out really, really good. But these things are really good for small plants. But if you got large plants, and you can look at that, whether or not it's indeterminate, whether or not it's a determinate plant, you can look at that and determine how you're going to have to grow. And when you're making that selection, whether it's at the feed store, whether it's at the box store, whether it's you're buying plants from somebody, ask the question, is this an indeterminate or is this a determinate? Understand what your garden, your space will allow for. One other thing I'll show you is a little bit of this. So this is on a patio, so you can't really stick any stakes into the ground. So what I've done is I've got them on the sides, on the edges, which won't hold all of the weight of these plants, so I have to really invest in bamboo to support it along the way. I wrap it around. You can kind of see I've wrapped it around those. And later into the season, now these are dwarf plants, later into the season, I'll go ahead and put another PVC, but I put them right into the buckets. It becomes a little bit more difficult, but it's certainly doable. My suggestion, if you are doing it on a cement patio, maybe take one of those U-posts, fill a bucket with cement, and put the U-post in that cement bucket, and then put the PVC on top of it. That'll hold weight always, so it'll allow some strength. But you can see there is a little bit of bend in some of it, but they all hold up. And so you can see I'm at the end of my season of tomatoes. So, but I kind of pretty much done everything. I've attached it to this tree before. It's a lot more twine. I attached it to this pull-up bar. You just got to make what works and what's reasonable for you. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between a dwarf tomato and an indeterminate tomato. You can see here, this one up front is a dwarf tomato. Most often, you can tell by the leaf structure. Usually they're a little bit more compact. The leaves are rugose, meaning you can kind of just see in the sense of the leaves how deep they are, whereas these leaves aren't exactly the same. And there's benefits to both. The only issue I have in Florida, or areas where you really need to have a lot of airflow, is that a dwarf plant generally stays a little bit more compact, meaning the leaves are sitting a lot on each other, and there's also a lot of moisture that can build up. So there's a lack of airflow, and it just takes a little bit of work to kind of clean them up to ensure that your airflow allows to continue to move through. Now, don't think that only dwarf plants have small fruit. There's a lot of dwarf plants that have larger fruit now, especially with the dwarf tomato project that's been going on. Mine in particular is just part of my selections that I found, and out of 20 plants, this is the only one that was a dwarf plant. Now, those plants have the genetics in them, but this is the only one that showed up. So that's it's kind of fun to go ahead and searching for it. Whereas these ones are indeterminate. These ones will continue to grow so long as they stay alive. You can kind of see they're all much taller. And actually, this plant is probably about a month and a half older than these plants over here. But with these indeterminate ones, you have an opportunity to get a lot more tomatoes, but it requires a lot more space to grow. So long as you have vertical space and you can go ahead and continue to move your plants up, that works out great. So it really comes down to It doesn't affect the flavor. There's all different varieties, whether it's dwarf plant, determinate ones. I don't have any determinate ones right now in my yard, but the determinate ones, basically, they're generally a little bit shorter. They don't continue to grow, and they set all their fruit basically at one time. So once you get all that fruit at once, especially if you're making like sauces and something where you need a whole bunch of tomatoes all at the same time, you get all your work done. Once those tomatoes are done fruiting, they're done. You can go ahead, cut them out, toss them in the compost pile, burn pile, wherever you're going to put them. But indeterminate ones will continue to grow so long as they stay alive. So a lot of the ones you see in the grocery store or that come from greenhouses, those are indeterminate tomatoes. And what they keep doing, they always look nice, but they keep doing is they keep removing the leaves from bottom up, and they have them on a string up above, and then coil the vine at the bottom, and they'll continue to grow and grow and grow. For Florida, I find that there's a certain point of the season where the temperature gets too hot, the bug pressure gets too high, and disease is very, very present, especially with the amount of rain that comes through. So, for us and for anybody who's looking at this, living in a different area, you have to have an understanding of what it is that your yard will allow. No one's going to be able to tell you exactly what that answer is. You have to find it out yourself, and that's kind of the fun part of all this, is to determine what grows best in your area, and how you're going to choose. So when you go to the farmer's market to pick up your plants, when you go to your nursery, your box store, or you're looking for seeds on a catalog, those are things that you really want to remember. So indeterminate tomatoes will continue to grow, and they'll continue to fruit over a long period of time, so long as disease doesn't wipe them out. Determinate tomatoes are smaller. You could possibly use one of those cheaper tomato cages like right here, but they'll fruit all at one time. Great for pasta or canning and things like that, where you need a whole bunch of tomatoes at the same point. But once they're done, they're done. And then you have a dwarf tomato, which is semi-determinate, and it will grow it'll continue to grow so long as it doesn't die, but it's more compact, it's more controllable, and every one of them have tomatoes that have great flavor. Every one of them has tomatoes that have disease resistance. So it's just a matter of finding the one that you like the most and having a little bit of fun with it. So let's talk a little bit about maintaining your plants. Obviously, these plants aren't in 100% best shape, but that's what happens. As your plants get older, as your plants mature, as the season moves on, you're going to find that diseases become much more prevalent on your plants. And just because disease is starting to show up doesn't mean your season is over. I have plenty of fruit on here that I expect to ripen, even though I have a lot of browning, some spotted leaves and some yellowing and things like that. Right now, I still have an opportunity to really get some fruit off of it. But the key is eliminating as much of the problem areas as possible. Two things I would suggest doing: you can either remove them with your pair of pruning shears. If you're doing that, keep a cup of bleach or some type of disinfectant, so you can go ahead and clean your pruning shears, because as you go from each individual plant, you don't want to be spreading anything that they may have. The other thing is, try to keep a bucket with you, so you can go ahead and when you're taking those leaves, you can go ahead and toss it in the bucket. I would suggest if they're diseased leaves, do not throw them in a compost pile. You don't want the soil pathogens to continue to thrive within the compost or within your soil itself. So the best thing you can do is you can burn them or send them to the dump. I hate sending things away, but sometimes it's the best thing, because you just don't want stuff to be kind of hanging out around your area. So what are you looking for? You've got some nice green leaves without really any issues. You see some leaves down here, and look, we've got one with a kind of a little spot. Is this because of the leaf miner in it? You can kind of see the leaf miner kind of working its way through the tomato leaves. Is that really a problem? It's not really a problem at first. But to me, a yellow leaf like this, and with the rest of the leaves being kind of green, it's just one of those ones where I say, okay, let me just go ahead and take that out. So if I had a pair of pruning shears, I'd go ahead and cut this. I don't, so if you don't have them with you, you can kind of bring it down and then bring it up against the vine, and the leaf will come off. And so I go ahead and I would put this in a bucket, and I would go ahead and move on to find more leaves. And there's a leaf down there you can see right here that definitely needs to go. So I'll go ahead and remove that. And again, most of the yellowing occurs where there's leaf miner damage already. So again, throw it in a bucket and get it out of here. And basically you're going to go through your plants and removing those. If you have a lot of them, yeah, it becomes a little bit of work, but it allows for a little bit more sanitation in your vines, and you'll get to go ahead and continue collecting fruit. So from these, I expect to get quite a bit more fruit, probably about 3 more weeks of fruit. And after that, I'll probably be looking to go ahead and finish them off. I don't allow the season to go all the way through. The reason behind that is because stink bugs get really bad where I'm at, and the rainy season starts coming in where the tomatoes don't look great. They fester, they split a lot easier, they got bugs, bites all over it, and I just kind of learned what my season looks like, and you just have to figure out what yours does. If you want to figure out what type of disease or anything that might have on it, go to your extension agency. Your extension agency can really help you. It might determine it's a fungal disease, where you could use some sort of like liquid fungicide. If it was some type of bug that you're seeing on your plants, that's causing some of these issues, then you can go ahead and find some sort of pesticide that you would use, whether it's organic, whether it's chemical. It's really kind of it's up to you. But the person next to you may not be the best at determining what the disease is, especially when so many of them look the same. There are things that will stick out, but at this point, we're just looking at maintaining plants and keeping them going. And doing those small things allow not only for sanitation, but it also continues that daily observation so that you're seeing what's changing within your plants. And that's what's so important with ensuring that you get fruit from your plants every single year, and that you're not running into plant failures. You're not going to be able to fix everything, but doing these small steps really helps in keeping your plants healthy. The reason you might pick them a little bit early, not fully ripened, is because you might have some insects like stink bugs, hornworms, or whatever. There's a particular part of the season where they start coming after them. Birds, squirrels may come after your tomatoes. Also, if it gets really hot and then gets really or starts raining a whole bunch, so a lot of rain and a lot of dry weather, those things can increase the splitting of the tomatoes. So some people want that full flavored tomato. They want to make sure that they capture everything that was going to come up from the plant. But to be honest, they ripen up perfectly inside. They may not be as completely as sweet, but the chances of you losing the fruit is a lot less. So you can see here, the one thing I always look for is the blossom end color. Sometimes you'll actually see it on the sides, like you can see just a little bit of orange right here. But this has got no color to it. So I could pick all these 3 tomatoes and leave this one for another day to ripen. You'll usually always see it that the first couple of tomatoes, the closest to the stem, actually are the ones that first ripen. So you'll start slowly picking away. You can kind of see a little bit of kind of a splitting damage. Now, another problem with if it starts to split like this, there's little ants and little bugs that'll like to get in there, start laying eggs, and it starts festering. And then you've got rotten smelling tomatoes out here. But you can see, just going through, there are slight changes. I mean, look at look at this color in comparison to this color right here. So it becomes very obvious when the tomatoes start to ripen. Now you might have some tomatoes that are green tomatoes naturally, so a lot of that goes by feel. So if you were to feel the tomatoes in comparison to one that's maybe not fully ripe, those feel like almost like those old 25-cent bouncy balls that used to be able to buy. And then the ones that start showing a little bit of color have a little bit more give to them. Here is a tomato nemesis. You can see it, it's a leaf-footed bug right there. And then its little babies right there, newly hatched. And then I think there's a few more eggs. Right there. So what do you do? Naturally you're going to run into a lot of things like this. This is probably the worst. So a lot of things you can control, especially like leaf eating or tomato eating bugs. Generally BT is a good practice, but with leaf-footed bugs and stink bugs, there is some pesticides that you can use. There's some traps. The best thing you can do is you try, when you see those little guys there, you try to get rid of them. If you see the eggs, you go ahead and smash them. You spend your day out here every single day, you're going to catch a lot of them. You're still going to get some damage to it, but you don't need to spray. But you got to do what's going to work for you. If you're doing this as a business, and you're trying to grow, or you're trying to grow for more than just or for your family and things like that, you have to do what you're going to need to do to get rid of stuff like this. You can also try to prevent a lot of or try to get rid of as many of them early in the spring as you can, but inevitably at the end these guys are going to show up. My thing is whenever I see them, I get rid of them. Everything's got its place, and I'll tell you that tomatoes, in the sense that I have here, don't necessarily belong here. This is a smorgasbord for them, and so it's partly why they show up. But you got to get rid of them, and so I'm going to go ahead and take care of that now, off camera. So let's talk about what end season looks like with tomatoes. For me, again, I still have probably, I'd probably say about 150 to probably 150 pounds of tomatoes still left to be able to pick. That'll probably bring me up to a lower amount than last year, but it's higher. I have a lower amount of plants, so it kind of works out. And I grew a lot less larger size fruit tomatoes. But you can see, look, I mean, there's stuff that's happening here, right? You have necrosis of the leaves. The branches are starting to slowly die. But the plant's still here. It's still got fruit on it. They're still ripening. And it's still got some leaves on it that are allowing it to continue to take energy. What you can see, though, is that in one particular area, this was kind of the onset of where disease really started. And you can kind of see it starting to push forward through this. And that has to do with whether it's spores, whether it's insects that are landing on it and then landing on something else. And then the diseases aren't actually even the same. Some diseases that were here started with tip die-off, and some of it started with older leaves. Some of it started, and these ones are turning yellow. The other leaves didn't turn yellow. They just died. They're really easy to take off too. But you can start seeing things. I mean, you can see this necrosis, but then follow the plant down. Oh wow, there's some green growth here, and wow, there's some green leaves down there. So there's all sorts of different things, and it doesn't mean just because your plant gets a disease that you better just clear it out and get rid of it. You can kind of keep it, especially if you have fruit that is starting to ripen and mature. It happens to everybody. No matter what you do, every single year your plants are going to die. Everybody's plants die. And, that's just a part of life. That's a part of an annual. And the key, though, is how long can you keep them and can you get them to fruit? And so that really is, one of those things where when you start seeing stuff, you're not really sure whether or not something's going to take it out. So the reason why I grow in buckets is because I have lots of wilt in my soil. So wilt will take out the plants very, very quickly, and the whole plant dies rather quickly. I didn't have any of that this year. I actually haven't had any of that since I've moved to buckets. And those are the things you have to learn every year. So what did I learn this year? What I learned this year is the amount of plants that I have and the amount of spacing that I have, I need to do a little bit better. So I need to do smaller amounts in the rows, and I need to take one row out, allowing a little bit more space. I also know that I need to take some preemptive strikes on tomatoes. So what am I going to try next year? I'm going to try doing what one of our organic farmers down here and in Florida is doing, which is using hydrogen peroxide at 3%, and going ahead and spraying the leaves, from the beginning of the plant's life and until into this part of the season. And it's great success. And the idea is that it kills the bacterial and fungal growth, prevents it from being able to grow. You still have to control your insects, but it definitely helps out in allowing your plants to remain healthy and continue on growing. Some of this looks, some of this to me is nutrient deficiency, right? Because it looks like nutrient deficiency. I've got some spotting over here that's purple because it's phosphorus. And part of it has to do with the disease preventing some of that stuff to move up. So things look like other things. That's why when you look up a particular disease, you look at Alternia, you look at Septoria, you look at blights, they all have different pictures. Nothing ever fits your own picture. Well, you're going to have to learn how to deal with some of that stuff. The easiest way to determine what type of disease you actually have is taking a diseased leaf or a sample to your local extension office. They can identify, with some money, of course, what particular disease that you have. Now, sometimes if you get to know somebody there, they may be able to do that by just looking at it and observing at it and knowing your location and knowing the things that were going on. So you will learn along the way what things are. If you see something affecting it, and let's say you don't want to pay for it, right? But if you see something affecting your plants year after year and it's the same dang disease, then the key for that is getting that test, right? Because if you can beat whatever that disease is, then you at least know you'll be able to go a little bit further into the season. You'll get more fruit off of it, and you'll know what steps to take. Maybe there's some preemptive stuff. Maybe what you need to do is you need to buy disease-resistant seeds or disease-resistant plants that aren't affected or can resist the disease itself. The tough part about tomatoes is there isn't a lot of genetic diversity. I mean, they look different. They're crazy in shapes and colors and sizes. But the thing about them is that it's really just one species of tomato. Now, they have done a lot of work breeding different species of tomatoes together to try to bring in some of the disease resistance of the wild tomatoes. But now we're having to select for flavor again. So, the tomatoes don't necessarily always taste great. The key really for you is identify what works. You can't be afraid of determining what the disease is, and if you're willing to risk it, let it stay. If it's early in the season and you see something with a disease, and you don't want to risk it spreading, because it will, get rid of it. That's the best advice that you and it's the hardest thing to do, especially if you have 20 tomatoes. I mean, even now, I have 80, 90 tomatoes, at one time, it's hard for me to go ahead and say, well, I got to cut you out of there. But sometimes you have to do it. I had late blight, or I had some type of blight moving through. I had to take this tomato plant out. But because I did, I saved the plants around it. I'm getting this row of tomatoes because I got rid of that one. I don't always make the right choices, but that's okay. It is gardening. It is about failure. It is about learning, and it is about getting better every single year. You all can do it. We all go through it. I have disease. I consider myself a halfway decent tomato grower. I consider myself knowledgeable. I consider myself a success when it comes to tomatoes. But they look like this sometimes, and that's okay.
Hi, I'm going to show you how to save tomato seeds today. It's pretty easy. Squeeze tomato seeds into a jar, add a bit of water, ferment them for a couple days, rinse, dry. But let's get started and show you some of my favorite tools. It's very easy, not necessary, but I love having a canning funnel. Comes in handy for lots of things around the house. Clear jars so you can watch the fermentation process. Masking tape and a Sharpie comes in handy for everything in the garden and in the kitchen. So I'm always doing multiple varieties of tomatoes at once, so it's really important to label, but even if you're just doing one variety, label, label, label. So this is my variety that I'm working on today, Cooney Pink. And of course, one of the supplies that we need are our tomatoes. Okay, so I've gone ahead and cut these tomatoes in different ways. Cutting a tomato like this with these little wedges makes it a little bit easier to also be able to eat some of your tomatoes. I don't like to just waste this. I do want to eat it. It's a little more work to do this. Alternatively, sometimes because I have so many to do and I don't want to sit here for hours carefully extracting everything, I'll cut it this direction instead, and then you can just squeeze these out into a jar really quickly and be done with it. And then I'll just toss this into my pot for cooking. I'll cut that part off. This version makes it a little bit cleaner, and I can just use my fingers, or I can get a spoon to pull all this tissue and the seeds away, and then have this to eat. It's a little less mangled than that. So something I wanted to show you about knowing when your tomatoes are ready for seed saving. You just have to get to know each variety, but this is one variety, the one we're still working with, Cooney Pink, and see the color difference in some of these, and you can't detect this through a video, but like this really deeper pinkish red color. This tomato's also a lot, it's got a little more give, and compared to this, which is still firmer and the color's a bit lighter, I might want to wait for this one to get a little more ripe and the seeds will be in better shape. Not always, but it's just a good rule of thumb to make sure they are a little bit overly ripe, not to the point where they're going bad. I still want to be able to eat this, but noticing the color differences might mean higher quality of seed. And of course, if you're going through all this work to save seeds, you do want to get high quality seeds, ones that are going to germinate and be vigorous. If you take seeds out of a tomato that's too young, it might taste delicious to eat, but it doesn't necessarily have the fullest, plumpest, most amazing seeds in it yet. So you might want to take a look at color differences in each of your tomatoes. Okay, so it's been 2 days and it's been quite warm in the house, so this process has been quick. Sometimes it takes longer, but you can see my jars have been molding, which is a good sign. That's what you want. The jelly coat around the seed is fermenting off, and you can see that the seeds have sunk to the bottom, which is also a good sign. And this is what I just leave in the windowsill to help me out. It's just a chopstick that I use to stir my seeds, and then I wipe it off in between each jar, just so I don't introduce seeds from one jar to the next, since I'm trying to keep my varieties separate. So the next step for me, now that the goo has sufficiently released from the seeds and they're on the bottom, and I can see some seeds are still floating on the top, which means that they're probably not viable seed, which is what we want. We're going to go ahead and rinse and dry these seeds off. Okay, so first I very carefully decant. And I'm not worried about losing seeds on the top because either they're not viable, they're so lightweight and not full of good material to grow a tomato next year that they floated, or for some reason they haven't fermented yet, but the rest of them did, and I don't want to let these sit in water for too much longer. So there's the first step. And what I keep doing is just adding more water, and I keep doing this slowly until the water is clear and most of the gunk is off, and then I rinse it through a colander. Alright, so I've rinsed and decanted from this jar a few times, and now I finally have my clean seeds free of most of the debris. And I love this little hand colander. I found it at the thrift store. It's perfect. Rinse off my seeds really well. And just to get some of the water out before we lay them on something to dry, just gently squeeze out the water. And typically I like to dry these on a cloth napkin or a dish towel because the seeds won't stick. Do not put them on regular paper. It's very annoying. The seeds stick and then you have to peel them all off individually. The only exception is coffee filters, which I'm going to use today, and they're nice because you can write on them and the seeds don't stick. So here on my kitchen counter I've got my coffee filter set up and labeled. So here's Coyote, this is Coyote, and just separate them out a little bit, and every day I'll come and separate these out a little bit more, and when they really start to dry I'll rub them between my fingers and separate the seeds because they do tend to clump together. And that's just a nice thing to have for later when you go to plant your seeds, that you're not dealing with clusters of seeds, that you're dealing with individual seeds. That said, if you're saving a lot, you might not get every single one separated, but there you go. So after a few days, they're usually pretty dry, and then I go ahead and label them and put them inside an envelope. And by the end of today, I'll have all of these filled up with seeds, and that's how you save tomato seeds.
Hey everybody, my name is Tim Noyes. I am a tomato grower, breeder in North Florida, and I wanted to give you some tips, 10 tips that I think can go and can be used anywhere where you would think about growing tomatoes. Okay, first tip is a daily observation. So what does that mean? A daily observation can be as simple as 15 to 20 seconds of looking at your plant, whether it's the morning, whether it's the afternoon. Make it consistent, because you should, if you walked out in the morning and you saw the plants were nice and strong, but then in the heat of the afternoon they're limping over and you go, oh my god, I've got some sort of disease. Well, that's not the case. But what you will catch is you'll catch those small little insect bites on those bottom lower leaves, or you'll start noticing you have some spotting on some of the particular leaves, generally near the bottom. If you can get a hold of those in the beginning, you can nip them in the bud. If you let them go too far, you might lose a lot more than you had expected. That's why a daily observation is the key to seeing something in the garden. Now, every single day you go out there, you won't notice much. What you will notice, though, is you will notice something that's off, something that just changed. You might not be able to spot it right away, but you know something's not right, and you'll be able to pinpoint it. So every single day, if you're looking at those plants, you're going to notice when things change, and that's kind of a really great part. Number 2, so for folks who do a lot of growing in soil, but aren't sure whether or not something that's going on is a deficiency, wondering how much fertilizer to put on a plant, how often to feed it. One of the keys to knowing your property, knowing your garden, knowing the soil that you're growing in, is knowing what it's deficient in. And by doing a soil test at your local extension office, you can go ahead and you find out a whole bunch of different things about your soil, whether or not you need magnesium, calcium, whatever it's deficient in, you can learn, and then you can add those things. The great part about that, though, is that you're building towards a greater soil that has everything that you possibly need. And if you do it every year, every other year, you'll see that you're continuing to build upon, and you'll also notice whether or not you're starting to go deficient in some things, and you can start trying to figure out and problem solve that. You know, in the sense of garden soil or potting mix or even your regular soil, if you're not having problems, you don't necessarily need to do a soil test. But it's when you're really getting to those points where it's like, could this be a deficiency? You know, and if it was, we can go ahead and fix that now. This really does help. So if you're seeing something consistent over a period of time and you're really wondering whether or not you're feeding your plants what it needs to have to live, then a soil test would be perfect for it. You can find out your pH. The things that you're not going to find out is nitrogen, but you already know the plant needs nitrogen anyways. But you'll find out your phosphorus, potassium, and all these other trace elements that are needed for the plant to be successful. Buying the right starts and the seeds. Depending on how you grow your plants, or whether or not you start from seed or whether or not you start them from a transplant you buy from a nursery, a box store, from wherever. It really does matter picking the right one. And so sometimes what people will do is they'll focus in on what's the healthiest looking one out of a bad lot, right? But the key really is they're looking at what is going on around the plants that you're buying. Because what's happening is they're overhead watering, so anything that's on top of those plants on the top rack is getting watered and being moved down to anything that even's healthy on the bottom. So how do you go ahead and beat that? Well, you can always ask whoever you're getting them from when they get their next shipment of vegetables in, because you can buy them then. Get them ahead of time, get them as soon as they get in, and you can kind of control what is being exposed to and what it's not. The other thing is, if you know that you have some sort of disease that you need some resistance to, then one of the best things to do is to locate those seeds or transplants that are better for fighting that disease. Or if you know your area is hotter or cooler than others, look for things that are cold tolerant or heat tolerant. It should have a description. If you don't know what it is and you don't have a tag for it or anything like that, it's a hodgepodge. But so if you know that you're going to have something that kills a normal tomato, you're really going to want to spend a little bit more time in the beginning looking for the right tomato or right vegetable to grow in your garden. Everyone's going to be specific, so what works for your neighbor may not work for you. What works for somebody up north is not going to necessarily work for someone that is down south. So, get to know your plants. If you have questions, ask the person who's getting the transplants in or the seeds. And if you don't know that, just Google it. Just ask them for the name of the plant, Google it, and find out which one's going to work out best for you. You can also go to the farmer's market and ask the farmers what they're growing. They'll be able to tell you, and you can go ahead and find those seeds and grow them also. So those are that's a really good idea, especially if you're selecting the wrong plant all the time. So prune in airflow. Especially down south, you really need to have air moving, because as it rains and as that humidity builds up, it's a breeding ground for bacteria and fungus. So one thing you can do is continue to prune the leaves to allow that airflow to move through. You can see a lot of times you'll have plants, the leaves will be so thick and they'll be landing on top of each other, and it just holds moisture in there. It could be laying on the ground, it could be laying on the pot, it could be laying on another tomato leaf. So those are all things you got to be looking at, and getting the spacing right. So what you can do is you can go ahead and take a pair of pruning scissors. You can pull them off yourself and just try to ensure that the airflow is able to go through, because you want the dew from the morning to be off the plant by mid-morning. You want any rain that's sitting on there to go away after a little bit, because the longer stuff sits on there, the better it is for fungus and bacteria to get kind of started. And it only takes a bug landing on it, picking up spores, going to the next plant. And it may not even be damaging your plant at all. It may just be moving from one safe place to the next, but it's spreading stuff along the way. So keeping that airflow and pruning those leaves is extremely important. Nothing touches the ground, nothing touches each other. Go ahead and remove it. Even though it might look a little bit sparse, it's better being sparse and living than being really green today and really bad tomorrow. Picking your tomatoes early. I cannot recommend this any more than this. I mean, it's just you know, I got tomatoes here that I picked yesterday, and let me get a little bit closer here. So you can see this is what I picked yesterday. This is what it will end up turning to look like. And the reason I pick it so early is because we have stink bugs, or leaf-footed bugs, where I'm at. And I'm not willing to allow the squirrels to grab it, though I haven't had that happen before. And I'm not willing to have the birds start pecking at it. And I've had a few of those earlier this year. So I try to pick it as soon as I start seeing that color in the blossom end. You know, that's at the very, very bottom of the tomato. And what I'll do is I'll pull it off and I'll bring it inside and I'll lay it on the counter. Now I know people who will go ahead and they'll put it on their porch. I just lay it on the counter. The one thing I have to be very adamant about is do not stick them in the fridge. If you stick them in the fridge, that sugar, that flavor kind of disappears. Leave them on the counter. Even in an air-conditioned place, they'll last 3 weeks after you pull them off, for the most part. If they have some damage to them already, those will ripen much quicker, and just eat them sooner. It makes it just as simple as that. The other things that you run into too is, especially in Florida, is you run into a lot of moisture, a lot of rain, and so you have a lot of splitting of tomatoes. If you pull them off early, you reduce the risk of having them split on the vine. Nothing worse than having a tomato go fully mature, and by the time you pick it, it's already rotting. So if you pick them early, yes, you're going to lose just a small bit of flavor, but you're going to have more than enough. It's going to be better than anything you can buy at the store. You know, you'll have it be sitting on your counting ready for you to eat it or turn it into whatever you're going to turn it into. So pick them early. Preventatives. You know, knowing what types of diseases you're going to run into. If you know you have a fungal disease, then you might want to do some sort of preventative in the sense of pre-treatment for fungus when you start growing them, right before the rainy season starts up, or before you know that the plants are getting a little bit older. You know, if you pre-treat them ahead of time, you can stop the spores, you can stop the thing from getting a grip. The problem is that if you wait, it's going to go past the point of where you can prevent it, and you're going to have to try to control it. Not everything can get controlled. As much as we'd love to see the plants live and live and live, you know, the less time and the less effort we put into in the preventative stage, the more likely they're gonna have a shorter lifespan. Doesn't mean you're not gonna get a lot of tomatoes from them, but you're just gonna shorten the lifespan. It really is dependent, right? So if you don't have any problems and you've never had a problem and you plant your tomato out there and everything's great, then obviously no preventatives is needed. But if you know year after year you're running into the same stuff, go get it diagnosed, figure out what it is, and then go ahead and start pre-treating it or preventing it or searching for something, like we said before, that is resistant to whatever the particular disease is, or you know, if you need to go ahead and put BT out because you have you know, a awesome population of armyworms that come in every single year and just Swiss cheese your whole entire planet. Well, there we go. You know, get some BT going, and then, you know, after it rains or whatever, just go ahead and go spray it again. And if you can keep on top of it, though, you're going to limit those issues, and that's in the preventative stage. But follow the directions on the bottle. Don't just go ahead and just spray everything on it. You know, go ahead and try to figure out what it is your actual issue, because you don't want to add any more cost to the tomatoes. So if you don't need it, don't use it. But if you do need it, then you know the next year, go ahead and start the regimen up. Ask people around you what they're getting, what are they running into. If you haven't run into anything before, but you really want to go ahead and make sure that you're not going to get, go find a neighbor, go meet somebody and talk to them and find out what stuff that they're looking at and what they're doing with their tomato plants. It'll give you a good idea of what you might need to do to set yourself up for the following season. Maturity brings disease. So, when a plant is small, when it's a seedling, you don't really run into Alternia, you don't run into Septoria, you don't run into those types of diseases, because generally the plant can go ahead and fight that stuff off at that early stage. As it gets older though, it's going to run into a lot more issues. It's got a lot more surface area. It's got it's going to run into more chances with an insect landing from one to another. So as the plant gets older, the chances of disease goes up. So what do I mean? Or what am I trying to say here? What I'm trying to say is that the plant's not going to live forever. As much as we'd like to see a tomato plant continue to grow and grow and grow and grow, it just doesn't happen. For most of us, the idea of just getting, 2 to 5 to 10 pounds of fruit from a plant, 10 pounds being really, really good, is kind of all we're looking for. So for me, 6 to 7 months of a life and I'm done with the tomato plants. I need my patio back. I need to go ahead and move on. And the plants aren't looking so great anyways. Yeah, they can get a resurgence later on, but I'm done. I want to go move on and start getting prepared for not only what my fall season is going to look like, but I also want to take a break. To be out there every single day, looking at everything, trying to treat stuff. We like to lay it by a little bit so we can give ourselves a little bit of a vacation, and that's usually for me July, August is usually where I'm not doing much of anything, and I might be looking in September on what I'm going to be doing next. But just know that expect to see disease once you start seeing the fruit start setting. Once you start seeing the flowers start going off, you're gonna see a lot of spotting. You're gonna see there's a lot of leaves that just die, and then you have new ones that grow up. So take those off, but just know it's okay. If you can get past a lot of the bad diseases, even if it does have something, you have a good shot of getting a harvest from your plants still. Grow as many different types as possible, so that you like. So I call it spreading your bets, right? So if all you want is a large slicer tomato that takes 110 days, or you saw it in a catalog, go ahead and get yourself some cherry tomatoes that may take 65 days to harvest. And by doing that, you're going ahead and making sure that you're getting something from these particular plants. If you invest all in these large slicers and you have a great year, awesome. But if you don't, and there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the later part of the season, you at least would have had those cherry tomatoes. So what I always suggest doing is, if you have something that you want to try, you have something that you want to experiment with, it's looked really interesting, get that, but get something that's tried and true. If you don't like cherry tomatoes or you don't like a particular thing, don't buy them. But you can find other tomatoes that are the ones that you're looking for that have less days to harvest. So if you spread that, that out, and even if you you have a particular disease, but okay, so you want to try a different one, get some disease-resistant ones that you're going to have to run into. Every year I have a check in my garden. I use some Hawaiian tomatoes that Gary Cass bred in 1960s, 1970s. So they have a huge disease-resistant package, and I know I'm always going to get those unless something comes and wipes everything out, which then in that case, nothing would have been able to survive in my garden anyway. So spread your bets, ensure that you're going to get some fruit from your plants. Long days, short days, disease-resistant, non-disease-resistant, heat-tolerant, regular. So that's really kind of a good idea to make sure that you get something out of the season. Keep the leaves dry as you can. So when you're irrigating, try to avoid any overhead watering. If you have to overhead water, then I would suggest looking at doing some preventatives ahead of time, such as some type of a fungicide or other type of treatment, so that you can control some of the stuff that you're inevitably going to run into. Again, you don't want to make it a breeding ground for anything. So you would think that the rain's always great for the tomatoes, but it's really not. So again, keep those leaves dry. If you see that you're watering and all of a sudden they're now touching the soil again, it looks like it's time to go ahead and cut that that leaf out of there. You've got to avoid as much of that as possible. The more you can cut out, the more you can eliminate, the more areas in which you can lessen a habitable environment for any of these pests or diseases, the better chances you are going to have at the end. And then finally, failure. It's probably one of the best things that can happen to you. Now, I know it doesn't sound good, and it never feels good. We all lose our plants, but guess what? All the plants die in the end. So know that, and it's just now you're just trying to increase the duration on which the plant is alive. If all you did was plant a seed in the ground and watered it and did nothing else, and it came up and you had more vegetables than you knew what to do with, that's fantastic. What happens when the neighbor comes to you and says, I've got this disease, I've got this pest, what do I do? You have no idea. I mean, you can look things up online, you can do all this types of stuff, but as you go through these trials and these issues, and you learn from them, and you start beating them and start succeeding, then what you'll have is so much more knowledge that you'll be able to help other people with. Think about it too, right? If the more you fail, the more you learn about your piece of property. The more you know what diseases are going to affect your stuff. When it's supposed to rain, when it's not supposed to rain. You start learning so many more things than if you just watered it and walked away. It's probably one of the greatest and hardest lessons, but in the end, it makes the successes so much better. So I just know that, it is okay to fail. It's okay to sometimes not have a season that works out. But what you learn through those failures is that you have less and less of those as you move forward. So I hope those 10 tips were helpful, and I hope your tomato season is good. Hey everyone, this is kind of what a breeding program looks like. Well, I guess the best part of the season, where you have the fruit in front of you, you can taste them, and you can kind of get an idea of what you may be selecting for with some of these tomatoes. But you can still see that even though as we move through the generations, we have a lot of consistency. There's still some tomatoes that are throwing off different genetics, and just because they're not the ones that you grew last year doesn't mean that it's not an interesting find or worth pursuing. So keeping track of them all is extremely important. What you don't see from looking at these tomatoes is you don't see what the vines look like. You don't see whether or not they were heavy producers. You don't know whether or not how disease resistant they were. So just starting with just the tomatoes, so if you bought some tomatoes that you thought were really, really good, but at the same time now, you're not sure what they actually did out in the field, you're gambling a little bit. But from just looking at the tomatoes, you'll see that each one of these is a line. So this is Lucky number 8. This is Potter. This is Orange 6. This is Lucky 5. This is Khaki Flask, a selection from Marsha Dillon. And this is Orange 5. And then this is Hawaiian Punch. Pretty much all of these came from the Zudi line. And the reason why I've done more Zudi than anything else, I've had larger sized tomatoes and everything else, it just had better flavor overall. So I went ahead and sent it out to several people to kind of go ahead and test. And Lucky 5 is the number 1, but the point that the person told me was that they really couldn't pick because they all tasted good, better than any ones at the grocery store, which is wonderful for people to say. But at the same time, it's not necessarily going to give you that information on what particular plant. But then people were able to give me some indications on what particular plants to save that tasted better than others. Some things that you won't be able to account for is ripeness of the tomato that whoever tasted it got, so you have no clue what their taste buds are. So it's kind of you kind of have to just what's outstanding, what sticks out to you, what's great. In each one of these lines, you can see there's a little bit of difference. This is just a regular red tomato, no stripes. Whereas everything else in Lucky 8 was basically a red tomato with green stripes. Now this one was much more dramatic in the sense of the green stripes, but you can also see there's a size difference. So which one was good? Actually, it was these two were the best. So not just because it's a larger size or looks really nice does not necessarily mean that it's going to turn out to be great. This potter came out from last year, which was surrounded by some type of viral disease. It never caught it at all. Now, it is not completely disease resistant as it's proven this year, but it produced a lot of tomatoes, and it looks, closer to like a large sun gold type tomato, and again, good flavor. These orange gold, basically orange 6, were really interesting. This one, number 8 out of all of them, really was cool because it kept the green striping and almost the green color. Some of them were showing it a little bit like this, but for the most part, these ones turned gold by the time they got completely ripe. And then Lucky 5, mostly these, red or brown colored tomatoes with almost like a purple flesh on the inside. But we did have some throw off red with gold stripes. And again, all these came from one tomato. So let's say the tomato looked very similar to this one last year that I saved, and I saved a bunch of them that looked exactly like this. You're still getting, in this generation, you're still getting some instability and flavor differences and things like that. The khaki flask is rather, obviously the green color is certainly showing up. None of the purple striping on this tomato really is showing on any of the plants. So that anthocyanin color, I know there were some that had it. This one is not. And I just really like the flavor of it. It's more of a fruity type flavor. This is green when ripe, and it's got a really cool shape. It was when I saw Marsha's find, I was like, I need to have that one. And then these orange 6s are really interesting. They were not this color last year. They were more of something like this in the sense of orange, or and so that's why it was called Orange 5. And as you can see, it definitely wanted to be red with green stripes. So that's kind of the neat part about this, is you just don't know what you're going to end up finding. And this is the Hawaiian punch. Now this is just where it was connected to the plant, it was blocked, but you can see as it gets hit by the sun, it gets this deep purple. These were rather bland in flavor, and everyone has a little bit different purple or anthocyanin color on top of them. Usually, so you can kind of see that even they may be getting hit by the full amount of sun, like for example this one, it had this really interesting, almost faded purple color, which was really cool, and it was one of the ones that people did like. But for the most part, they were without flavor. So then what do you do with them, right? So let's say you select, this is the third, these particular 2 were the best. Well, then you go ahead, and those are the ones that you want to collect. And then the rest of these, it doesn't mean they're bad tomatoes. You can just, you no longer have to worry about tracking them and everything else. You also want to be looking at specifically the sizes. Now, I had some sizes that were much larger than this, but that's not really what the normal size for the particular fruit was. So just because that first fruit comes off and it looks really interesting, generally those first fruit, have fused tomatoes, or fused together and create these kind of weird, interesting tomatoes, but it's not really kind of consistent. So select the ones that are the normal size that are for each of the plants, and that'll give you a good idea. Keep everything tracked. This is plant 1, plant 2, plant 3, plant 4, plant 5, plant 6, plant 7, plant, and 8, 9, and 10 Now there were more out there at one point, but not all of them made it. So, and before I started collecting it, obviously I'm not going to collect a plant that doesn't exist anymore. So that didn't get any fruit off of it. So that's chopped off, and so they won't show up. So I move the numbers up. And then once you go ahead and do it, then you start saving the seed. And once you get those, and you basically can enjoy the rest of your tomato season. But that's kind of the fun of everything, right? It's experimenting. You're learning new stuff. You're learning a lot more about genetics. You're learning about somehow recessive traits are showing up. And you're seeing a lot of physical stuff, but also you're learning a lot from the stuff that you don't necessarily see. And, so if anybody's interested, you can do breeding either by buying, getting a plant that's already a hybrid and dehybridizing it, trying to make it normal, just checking to see what it's got involved in it. You can easily find ways to breed tomatoes online in books. But the only way you really can do it is just doing it. It's going to be okay that you fail. Not every single one of them is going to set. But don't worry about it. Just keep trying, and eventually you'll get it, and you'll get a cool cross out of it. There's a lot more information that goes into actual breeding, but this is just kind of just a tip of the iceberg to either, if it piques your interest, go read more, ask more questions. It's a lot of fun, and you have the ability to create that you didn't even know, and it's within your DNA, because as human beings we've been doing this for years. The selection and saving the seeds of particular plants. So hope that this interests you a little bit more into breeding tomatoes. Hey everyone, welcome back to my garden. I'm just going to talk a little bit about keeping track of your plants, especially when you're breeding. It's so important. These are Orange 6. They all came from the same tomatoes that I saved from last year that came from the same plant. But now, this year, they're all individual tomato plants, or tomato vines. And so I know I have an Orange 6 over on the back side over here. But, so this one starts out as Orange 6-2, Orange 6-3, Orange 6-4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And the key is really kind of taking some notes. So you can see this one right here. Orange 6-8 is a nice indeterminate vining and can continue to grow. Also, kind of the neat thing about this one is all the other ones have orange with gold stripes. This one has orange with green stripes, and that's pretty neat because I haven't seen that so far in my bunch. But the rest are all kind of the same. So the key really is to start narrowing in what are the good plants, what are the plants you want to avoid, and then taking that fruit and then putting them in these, or bringing them into the house to log them. So what I do is I always keep a pad of paper, and I use these just regular trays that usually for planting, and I just capture the information plus the number. So sometimes I'll lose track, or I'll mess up, or I'll shake it, or whatever. And if you can't figure it out, then you're pretty much, you still have good tomatoes that you can share, but you just don't have the information, and you can't be sure that is the particular one that you want to select from, or if it came from a good plant, or whatever the case may be. You lose all that information. Doesn't mean you still can't save the seeds. You certainly can. What's a good thing I do too is when I do this, when I bring them inside, before I bring them inside, I take a picture of where they're at. I try to put, I'll try to make sure that I can figure out, like if it does get all mixed up, I can try to put it back, place it back together. But it becomes an extra part of this process. If you have just a few plants, not such a big deal. Have 80 plants, becomes a little bit bigger of a deal. And I'm slowly getting better and better at this every single year. There are ways to make things a little bit more efficient. I could mark on the fruit. I don't mark on these ones because they're so small, and if it was a larger fruit, it wouldn't be that big a deal to me because I can cut around that. But using a permanent marker or something on these makes it a little bit more difficult. But anyways, just thought it'd be a quick video just to kind of give you an idea of how, we just kind of keep track of the stuff that we're bringing in.